What happens when a black woman refuses to smile through a rigged system? They called her uncooperative and buried her candidacy. But the voice they tried to silence became the one that exposed them all. Thanks for listening. Like, comment, subscribe. Tiana Brooks had done everything right. At 28, she held a master's degree in public health, a resume that spanned 4 cities and 3 state-level initiatives, and a reference list that could make most hiring managers pause and respect. She had worked tirelessly for years, often clocking in before sunrise and out long after dark, driven by a simple, persistent belief that she could make systems more humane. So when she received an email inviting her to a final round interview for the Strategic Health Equity Advisor position at the prestigious Dinford Medical Consortium, she felt hopeful. Dinford wasn't just any organization. It was the most influential policy advisory group in the state. Landing a role there would mean a platform, funding, credibility, all the things Tiana had fought to earn. The interview was scheduled for 11:15 a.m. on a Wednesday. She arrived 20 minutes early, dressed in a charcoal gray suit with a pressed blouse. No jewelry except for a small silver ring, a gift from her grandmother, who always said it brought clarity. Her hair was pulled back in a neat bun. Her posture was open but firm. As she entered the marble-floored lobby, the receptionist gave her a brief glance, a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes, then directed her toward the 14th floor. "You're meeting with Director Hammond and 2 others," the woman said. "Room 1426. Tiana smiled politely. "Thank you." The elevator ride was smooth. The hallway was quiet, filled with abstract art and glass panels that reflected the morning sun. She reached room 1426, knocked twice, and was ushered in by a young assistant who barely looked her in the eye. The interview panel sat behind a long conference table. 3 white faces, 2 men and 1 woman, all in tailored suits. They glanced up from their notes as she entered, each smile tight and brief. Director Hammond, tall, graying at the temples, with a voice like polished stone, gestured toward the chair across from them. "Ms. Brooks, thank you for coming." Tiana sat down, placing her folder neatly on the table. "Thank you for the opportunity." What followed wasn't what she expected. For the first 10 minutes, the panel asked standard questions: her experience with community-based programs, her thoughts on recent state health policy, her strategies for integrating equity metrics. Tiana answered each one clearly and confidently. But then the tone shifted. Director Hammond leaned back, arms crossed. "Can you tell us about a time you encountered resistance because of your background?" She hesitated. "Do you mean professional resistance?" "Well," he said, voice casual, "you mentioned in your cover letter that you've worked on projects with diverse populations. Surely, you've had moments where race or cultural differences influence dynamics." The other 2 panelists nodded faintly. Tiana kept her voice even. "Yes, I've seen how structural bias can impact team performance and client trust. That's why I center transparency and accountability in my work." The woman on the panel scribbled something in her notebook. Director Hammond smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I suppose what I'm asking is, how do you avoid becoming overly personal when addressing those topics?" Tiana blinked. "I focus on the data," she said, "and I use stories to contextualize the human impact." One of the men, the younger one, with a haircut too sharp for his age, leaned forward. "You don't find that making race a central lens can alienate other groups?" There it was. Tiana felt a familiar coldness settle into her shoulders. The unspoken message that her expertise was useful, but her identity made it inconvenient. She stayed composed. "Equity work isn't about alienation," she said calmly. "It's about accuracy and repair." They moved on, but the undercurrent had shifted. The remaining questions were sharper, more skeptical. They asked if she'd ever managed a non-urban project, if she was comfortable navigating predominantly traditional stakeholders, if she had learned to adjust tone when necessary. By the end, Tiana's breath felt shallow. Still, she stood, thanked them, and walked out of the room with her back straight. In the elevator, she exhaled slowly, trying to release the tension from her chest. She didn't cry. She didn't curse. She simply walked out of the building, sat in her car, and stared at her reflection in the rearview mirror. It was supposed to be a normal interview, but it had left something sour lodged in her gut, something she couldn't ignore. By Friday, Tiana still hadn't heard back. Not that she expected much after the thinly veiled microaggressions during the interview, but part of her, the part that had spent years fighting for a seat at the table, still hoped. Still believed that her qualifications might override their discomfort. She told herself to let it go, to move forward. She applied to 2 more positions that afternoon, cleaned her apartment, ran errands, and even went to yoga. But that quiet ache lingered. Saturday morning, her phone buzzed with an unexpected notification that it was a message. Not from the hiring team, but from someone she barely remembered, Julia Klein, a policy associate she'd met once at a state conference. They hadn't spoken since. The message was short. "You didn't hear this from me. Check your name in this thread. Internal staff forgot to lock the folder." Link below. Tiana hesitated, then clicked. It led to a cloud-based internal workspace, clearly intended for Denford staff only. Somehow, Julia had found a crack in their security wall. The folder was titled, "Final Candidates, Hammond Review Notes." Tiana scrolled through. Each candidate had a subfolder. Hers included a resume, her submitted writing samples, and beneath that, a comments document. She clicked. Her breath caught. Brooks, strong background, but highly DI-oriented. May push uncomfortable agendas. Could alienate board donors. Comes off intense in person. Below that, another line in red. Would be difficult to shape in the role. Caution. Tiana froze. Her hands began to shake. This wasn't constructive feedback. It was a warning label. A coded rejection not of her skills, but of her personhood, her identity, her voice, her refusal to be shaped. She scrolled further and found notes on another candidate, a white man with fewer credentials, fewer years of experience. Not as policy savvy, but very coachable. Would reflect well with stakeholders. Approachable. She closed the file. Her heart pounded with a quiet fury. They hadn't been evaluating her work. They had been evaluating her compliance. Her willingness to play by rules built to exclude people like her. This wasn't just rejection, it was confirmation. By Sunday evening, Tiana had read the file 3 more times. She tried to let it go. She told herself it wasn't worth the emotional cost, that she'd known, deep down, what that interview really was the moment she walked into the room. But the words kept flashing in her mind like a warning flare, highly DI-oriented. Push uncomfortable agendas. Would be difficult to shape. She wasn't furious because she'd been rejected. She was furious because of why. Monday morning, she got an email from the Denford HR department. It was brief. Clinical. Dear Ms. Brooks, thank you for your time and interest in the Strategic Health Equity Advisor position. We regret to inform you. She deleted it without finishing. But something shifted inside her. She pulled out her notebook, the one she usually reserved for strategy plans, and began to write. Not policy notes, not action items, but everything she'd experienced in that interview. Word for word. Every question, every glance, every phrasing laced in respectability, but rotting underneath. She didn't intend to share it at first. It was just survival. A record, a release. But then she remembered something from the comments file. Could alienate board donors. And she thought, is that what they're afraid of? Being seen? That night, she opened her laptop, created a new blog under a pseudonym, The Unshaped Voice, and posted her account. She removed names, omitted the company, but left the substance raw and unmistakable. She didn't market it. She didn't even post it to her personal social media. But within 48 hours, the post had been shared over 12,000 times. She received private messages from strangers, young professionals, healthcare workers, nonprofit leaders, mostly Black women, who had sat in those exact same chairs, heard those same questions, and walked out with the same invisible wounds. They thanked her. They called her brave. They told her they thought they were alone. And for the first time in weeks, Tiana felt something heavier than anger. She felt responsibility. The post was never meant to go viral, but by midweek, it had caught fire. A well-known journalist from a national equity-focused media outlet reached out, asking for a formal interview. Tiana hesitated. She wasn't looking to become the face of anything. But when she checked her inbox again, there were over 40 messages, people sharing eerily similar experiences. Some from healthcare, some from law, some from public education. It wasn't just her. She agreed to the interview, on her terms. Still pseudonymous, still with no names revealed. But the journalist, thorough and seasoned, began connecting dots. Dinford Medical Consortium had a pattern, rotating out candidates of color at the final stages, replacing them with neutral faces. 3 women from different cities reached out to the journalist independently, all referencing interviews with Hammond's division. When the article dropped, it was explosive: health equity or optics. How top institutions are quietly filtering out voices that won't play along. Within 24 hours, the article was trending on Twitter, featured on a podcast, and cited in 2 national newsletters. Dinford issued a vague public statement: "We are committed to equity, inclusion, and transparency. Any concerns raised will be reviewed internally." Tiana read it twice. She almost laughed. Internally. Of course, that be why Friday. However, the heat had grown too strong. A staff member from within Dinford leaked a follow-up memo that directly referenced public backlash over the Brooks matter. Her name, her story, and just like that, her pseudonym crumbled. Her inbox was flooded again, this time with media requests, invitations to panels, TV spots, podcast appearances. Some wanted her to speak. Others wanted her to fight. But she said no to all of them. Except one. A local community health coalition invited her to speak. Not on a stage, not on camera, but in a church basement on the south side of the city, where she'd once volunteered in grad school. She stood in front of 50 people, most of them young women of color, and said, "They didn't reject my resume. They rejected my refusal to apologize for who I was while doing the work. And what I learned is this: the line between being shaped and being erased is thinner than we think." The room was quiet. Then someone in the back stood up and said, "We got you." And the applause that followed wasn't performative. It was ancestral. It was fire. Weeks passed. The headlines eventually faded, as they always do. Another scandal. Another reshuffling. Another cycle of statements, promises, performative remorse. But something had shifted, not in them, but in her. Tiana no longer refreshed job boards daily. She no longer tried to calculate how to soften her tone or reshape her words to make gatekeepers comfortable. That version of herself, the careful, curated one, had been quietly dismantled, and in her place stood something sturdier. She still received occasional hate mail, of course. Anonymous messages accusing her of playing the victim, of being difficult, of ruining a good man's career. But those notes landed differently now, like dull echoes against a wall she no longer lived inside. Because something else kept happening too. People kept writing to say, "I stayed in the room because of you." Young women, new graduates, even mid-career professionals, some from overseas, sent voice notes, essays, handwritten letters. A school nurse in Minneapolis, a mental health counselor in Detroit, a grant writer in Birmingham, each one describing their own version of the room. The moment they were asked to smile while shrinking, and how. After reading her story, they didn't point one afternoon. She was invited to a roundtable organized by a coalition of independent health justice networks. Not a corporate panel, not a PR move, just people doing the work. One of the moderators, a former midwife turned policy advocate, introduced her as the woman who reminded us that being unshapable is not a flaw. It's the only way to make change that lasts. Tiana sat with that for a long moment, not because she believed she was a hero, but because, for the first time in a long time, she believed she wasn't alone. Later that week, she joined the advisory board of a new grassroots organization focused on mentoring first-gen women of color entering the public health field. They didn't pay her much, but they listened. They asked for her voice, not her polish point. One evening, she stayed late after a community planning meeting and walked to the bus stop just as the sun dipped low across the skyline. Her phone buzzed, another message from someone she'd never met. "I almost quit. Then I found your words. Now I'm applying again. Thank you." She didn't respond right away. Instead, she looked out over the street, the cars, the people, the city she still believed could be better, and smiled softly. They weren't supposed to remember her. She wasn't supposed to matter, but she did, because she spoke, because she refused to disappear, and because sometimes, even a quiet voice, one that won't be shaped, softened, or silenced, is the one that changes everything.